This video will introduce you to the Middle Ages and will explain to you some of the background and context about the Middle Ages with respect to England and Great Britain. One thing that you'll notice about our text, the Longman Anthology of British Literature, is that the first part that I had you read, the introduction, actually takes you all the way to the 15th century. We will, obviously, with our first reading with Beowulf, not be going all the way to the 15th century. We'll just be in the first part of the Middle Ages. So in this introduction, I'm just going to cover up until the time period that we'll be discussing with Beowulf. And as you can see, there are some empty spots in the presentation. As we read and go further in time, we'll fill those spots in. At the end of the unit, I will provide a link to this presentation that doesn't have my voiceover, but that you can link into and look at the different things that I have written there to check and correct any notes that you might have missed as you are taking notes listening to the lectures. So let's get started with talking about the Middle Ages. So in our text starts with a quote from the Venerable Bede, and Bede is actually a writer during this time period, and he is famous for, sorry, gotta switch my notes here. I thought I had them on the right page. My bad. Okay, he is famous for writing his very influential ecclesiastical history of the English people. And he wrote this in the early 700s. And what this allows us, the reason you'll often hear Bede talked about a lot is because his manuscripts have allowed us to understand what medieval Britain was like, what the Middle Ages was really like, and it gives us some sort of facts to go from, though we do have to consider the fact that it's one guy writing it, so we're getting his perspective, right? So what we'll be learning this semester is that there are theories about history and things in the past, and the things that we take as the truths are usually what the majority of scholars agree on are the most plausible theories. So one thing you'll notice in this course is that there will be a lot of history that will go with the literature, and that's really because of a few things. One is because this is a class in the United States, chances are you probably didn't take a British history course, and so some of this really important history stuff you need to know might not be something that you have been exposed to before. But so I feel like I need to do you a favor and kind of fill some of the history in for you, because really when we're talking about literature, we're talking about understanding human experiences, and you really can't understand the perspective and the audience of a time period unless you have at least a little bit of knowledge about the background of the time period to understand what the audience was like, and why certain texts are written the way that they are. So that's my little chat about why there'll be some history stuff. What I want to make clear to you is that this is a literature course and not a history course. So while I'll be giving you some of this history stuff to kind of give you the background, I won't be testing you like I might test you in a history course where you have to know precise dates and things like that, mainly because I want you to focus more on the concepts. I mean, you need to know what century we're in, but if you don't remember that this was written in 1752, that's fine. But if you know it was in the 1750s, then I think you're doing pretty good. Okay, So back to Bade. So this time period, and this is the time period of Beowulf, and this is before the Norman conquest, and this is from 700 to about 1066 is when we're placing this. We're in medieval Britain, and oh, sorry, zoomed too fast. There we go. And what scholars define medieval Britain as is a meeting place for complex, multi layered groups of diverse cultures and peoples from as far south as Italy to as far north as the domain of the Vikings. So the major settlers in this area are the Celts, the Romans, and some Germanic tribes, which were mainly made up of the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Um, each group, as it settled, brought its own language, literatures, and cultural studies to the period from over 10 to 1066, 100 to 1066. And because there are so many different people that are coming together, it really produced hugely different cultures and artistic works and just very diverse and rich and that can challenge the imaginations of different peoples. You really have a blending of people. What our book points out about this, and what I think is really important for you to understand, is that while the emphasis that even though there are all these different people and languages, we shouldn't define that as multiculturalism like we might define multiculturalism today. Today, when we define multiculturalism, what we're talking about is preserving of different cultures within a unified state or a nation. That's not exactly what they were doing. They weren't trying to preserve their Germanic history when they were in beginning to conquest, beginning to move into England. Instead, they were okay with taking some stuff from the Celts and the Romans and kind of melding it all together. So I think it is important to know that. It is, however, useful to think about medieval Britain before and even long after Bade as being densely layered with influences of communities that divide things in terms of geography, language, ethnicity, as well as gender and class, as Damaroche points out in the Norton Anthology. I'm sorry, the Longman Anthology. It's easy to get them mixed up. They're the two big guys. So it is important to remember that these peoples that were there at this time really influence what England becomes to what England and the English language became and becomes and is today. I think that often when we think of this stereotype of British people, modern British people, we think of them as, some sort of like stodgy old white men, smoking a pipe and being very polite. And I think that one of the things that some people find, you might not find this surprising, is that England is a diverse place of people of very different cultures and races, and and they do have different class lines and different languages too. There are different variations of England, not quite of English, not quite unlike the variations of the English language that we have in the United States. There is a difference between how someone from Brooklyn, New York talks versus how someone talks like me from Columbia, South Carolina, where I have this nice, thick old Southern accent. We have words and phrases that mean different things. And so you have differences in language the same in Britain as we have in the United States. And even not, it doesn't necessarily just have to be location, but it also could be, class or education status, the way someone talks. And it can also be audience too. I know, like, I got a big old Southern family, right? So when I get around them, I talk completely differently than I do in maybe a more professional setting. I'm going to use a lot more slang. I'm going to, my accent, even just talking about my family, my accent starts to come out a little bit more. It's going to change based on my audience. And that's one of the reasons why we study this stuff. Because I'm going to probably guess that in this class there's going to be zero, maybe one person that's interested in going into the study of the Middle Ages. um, so, why would you really learn this? Well, that's one of the reasons why we do learn that, is to be able to recognize different audiences and different purposes, and how language changes and shifts based on audience and purpose, so that you can learn more effective ways to utilize those skills when you're writing and composing things. So we'll be talking about that as the semester um, progresses. So again, just to kind of recap, it's a meeting place of diverse cultures. You have the Celts, you have the Romans, you have Germanic tribes, particularly um, the Scandinavians, which we'll be talking about with Beowulf, and the Scandinavian tribes, and those are mainly the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. So that's what I want you to take away from here. Okay, and this is just an image of Bede the Venerable I found. I thought it would be interesting. Okay, so in some books you'll see people refer to it as medieval studies. I will sometimes do it too, because when I first started studying it, that's what it was called. But now that's kind of like passe. You don't really call it medieval anymore. Instead, the proper thing to do is to call it the Middle Ages. And the reason is that because in the Renaissance period, which that's during Shakespeare's period, which we'll get to this semester, they started referring to this period of time as the Dark Ages, or the medieval period, because they wanted to distinguish themselves from that time period, because they start to revive classics from the Greeks, and they used the term pretty derogatorily. It basically meant, oh, you're so medieval, or you're stuck in the Dark Ages. It would kind of be like some, snotty kid telling an adult who isn't very comfortable using technology, oh, you still live in the Dark Ages. So it's one of those silly quibbles within scholarship, and they started referring to this time period as the Middle Ages. We've now started returning to it as the Middle Ages, because as we've uncovered more history and more text, we see that the humanists in the Renaissance period were actually just being kind of jerks. Because there actually was a huge time of growth politically and socially, that, until we've unearthed some things, we kind of think because of Google that, like, we know there's no mysteries left in the world. But let me tell you, we unearth literature and historical documents all the time. And once in the 70s and 80s, these things started to come to light. That's when the shift to calling it the Middle Ages, in the late 90s, uh, really in the early 2000s is when we started calling it the Middle Ages. So you'll see it referred to as both, but just something interesting. So the people that I were telling you about, the Celts, the Romans, the Germanic tribes, these were the people that were making up this melting pot island of islands of Great Britain. And so the Celts are the first group that I want to tell you a little bit about, because it'll be important to know some of this as we're reading some of the different things in this first textbook. So here, I just thought this image was really interesting. This is some of the artwork that the Celts in the manuscripts they had, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I don't want you to try to memorize all of this stuff. What I'm looking for, I'm giving you a lot of information in these slides. I'm looking for that you get overall summary type information from this. I'm not looking, and nor do I think it's useful for you to memorize a lot of vocabulary, but rather I'm more interested that you can kind of summarize the information. I mean, yes, it would be important to remember the Celts, the Romans, and the Germanic tribes made up early England. That would be a good fact to memorize. But in terms of saying, well, these are the Brittonic Celts, or these are the what's the other, the Gaelic Celts. You don't necessarily have to remember all of those things, but you should remember that there are different groups of Celtic people. Okay, so the earliest immigrants are called the Brittonic Celts, and they begin arriving in Britain around 400 BC, and that is when we get a recorded history of Britain. So they were like the first guys there, um, and they were known as the Brittonic or British Celts, and they made contact with the continental Celts, especially in Brittany, which is part of France. So the British Celts gave rise to the branch of Celtic language of Welsh in medieval Britain, which later formed the basis for the language used today in Wales. Um, Wales is part of England. It's part not England. England's its own country. It's part of the British Isles, of Great Britain. And we often, when we think of Great Britain, we don't think of people as speaking anything other than English there. But in Wales, they speak Welsh. They do not speak English. Though a lot of people do speak English, just like other parts of the world, but they speak Welsh, and it's important to know that. The Celts had many myths and legends, and they brought those ideas with them. They were um, pagan type tribes that are later converted to Christianity in some cases, and they incorporated some of these ideas into the stories that we get, like King Arthur. And their most important early work comes from this shadowy poet called Taliesin. Um, and one of their cultural contributions, they kind of stuck to themselves a little bit, that they did co-meld with the Romans and parts of the Roman occupation in 100 to 400. And so here are some of those like elaborate Celtic manuscripts. This is an image, and it's actually a real picture. It's not a drawing. It's a real picture of of one of the manuscripts that has been recovered from this time period. And I'll provide some links if you just want to look through some pictures of some really cool old books. That not really it's optional. It's not really required. But I'll put some links in there if you're interested in looking at some of these cool old pictures. But this is one of the manuscripts about beasties, and you can see this is kind of the little beasties. And here is another drawing, and this is, I believe, this one. Oh shoot, where's my notes? I think this is Saint Joseph, and it's from the Litchfield pieces. And now where I got my notes on my iPad, of course, it's going to lock up because it doesn't want to be cooperating with me at this time. But I believe that's Saint Joseph in the Book of Kells, but I could be completely wrong. I will fact check that and get back with you on that one, because I can't access my notes at the moment. Hopefully they'll pull up before we're finished with the lecture and I can tell you about it. So another group you get are the Gaelic, or what we would say Gaelic, or Irish Scottish Celts. And they had vernacular poetry. Vernacular is a fancy way of saying the everyday language. So they wrote in everyday language, and they also produced manuscripts. That is from the Book of Kells. That's what, there was the note right up here for me. They also produced things, but they were in a different part of the country. So you have of the British Isles. So you have what we think of, what we think of England on the map. That's where the Brittonic Celts were. The Gaelic Celts were in what we think of Ireland and Scotland. And then what we think of Ireland and Scotland. And the Brittonic Celts were also in parts of what we call Wales. And they ended up basically over time, as England would get occupied, they basically got pushed into Wales, and those families, generations of Welsh people have, kind of been there. Um, so these Celts settled in Ireland. I'm all over the place. Sorry, guys. Let me get back here. They settled in Ireland and in Scotland and in Argyll. Yes, it's where the Argyll sweater comes from. Um, and they became the dominant social and linguistic group in Ireland as their language split off from that of the British Celts. So basically, you had, um, these peoples in Britain and in Wales, and then they would split off into tribes and go up into Scotland or into Ireland. Um, and their language changed. Their language was similar, but their accents and their slangs changed based on culture. And that Celtic language that is still used in Ireland and and parts of Scotland, called Gaelic, is something that is still used. So there was they have their own heroic narratives. They have their own poetry that's oral, just like the Brittonic uh, Celts, and there's also included women as figures of power, which is unusual for this time period. And remember, when we talk about poetry, when you think of poetry, you might think of, I mean, I did at least, when I first even started majoring in English, I never was a huge fan of poetry. It was a acquired taste. Over a long time, I finally started to like it. But one thing I've always liked is a good story, someone to tell me a good story. And, when you think of a time when, you know, there isn't really much to do for entertainment. You don't have a television, or you don't have, elaborate clubs or anything to go visit. And so telling stories around the fire um, is something to do to entertain yourself. And so I think you could see how women, that kind of tells you how women probably fit in the society as people that would be able to tell stories as well. So that's probably why they might have been seen as figures of power. And I think in some ways that's where like the idea for brave came from in Disney, if we want to talk about how this relates to kind of popular culture today. Okay, so you have the Celts, right? So another group are the Germanic migrations. And the reason we say Germanic is because there's so many different ones. And it is just easier to say the Germanic migrations because you have all these Scandinavians coming in, you have the Norse, you have people from Sweden, you have people from all these different Germanic tribes that are coming in. The three that we talk about are the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And we just lump them together sometimes because it's just simpler to think of it that way. The Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes migrated and invaded medieval Britain after the withdrawal of Roman forces in the 5th century. This group displaced the British Celts and settled roughly the eastern half of modern day England. Okay, so I told you that you have the Brittonic Celts, and when I just said, the Welsh, they don't really speak English, they speak Welsh. That's when these Germanic tribes, who were really rough and tumble Vikings, when they started pushing in, those Brittonic Celts, they just kind of fled to Wales, and no one ever wanted Wales, so they just stayed there, and no one bothered them in Wales. Um, so that they pushed in. And of course, when you talk about someone pushing in and invading, not everyone leaves. It's not like they make an announcement, hey, we're coming in today, and everyone leaves. People stay and they marry, and this is how those things start to blend in. What got it added to the culture here when the Germanic tribes came is this is when that Germanic paganism comes in. This is when you get those Norse gods like Thor. I'm sure you've heard of Thor lately. I think that's been a popular movie. This is when you get those Norse gods that start to influence the Celts and the culture. And then the Romans, who have their roots are in Christianity, this is when you start to get some of the Christian settlers coming in too. And so you have this interesting blend of paganism and Christianity that's all kind of melding together. And that's where we get the text of Beowulf, which we'll talk about in the next presentation. I'll talk a little bit about Beowulf in this presentation, but the next presentation I'll talk even more about Beowulf, giving you some things to look for while you're reading. But that's where we get this melding of cultures in Beowulf, because it is a blending of these different things, and it's not so simple. It's not, it is actually real life. It's not black and white. So they people are people, and they're not typically, in my experience, and this might even sound naive of me, but people typically tend to be middle of the road about kind of things, and that was where the influences kind of just melded together, whether they always made sense or not. And then the Vikings come in the 8th century, and those are the Scandinavians that came in, and they really just cleaned house, honestly. And they settled in the area north, so even into parts of Ireland. And they were a huge political force in medieval Britain, or the Middle Ages of Britain, by the 800s and early 900s. And so they're really, taking control. And someone has told me about, there's a really cool documentary on the History Channel about the Vikings right now. It is totally on my queue to watch. I cannot wait to watch it. I just have not had time quite yet. But I encourage you, like, if you're really interested in that stuff, watch it. It will help you to understand some of the things you're reading tremendously. If you're into watching some History Channel stuff. I know they've got a pretty good one on the Vikings right now. And I just want to show you this picture. This is one of the fortifications when they stopped being so nomadic, and we're actually starting to make settled areas. It was a wall for protection, and this is a modern picture, but the wall, you can see Hadrian's Wall. It's still standing, and it's very long, and you could actually go and look at the wall if you wanted to go to England. And I thought this was cool, just something neat. Here is an early map in 950, and this is what it looked like. And this is actually, not a drawing. This is a picture. Well, I mean, someone did hand draw it, but it's not a modern drawing. It's actually a picture of something that was in a manuscript that I took from the British Library. So this is the map. As you can see, it's simple, but it tells you where, all the big guys live, all the big areas, big castles. Let's see if we can get back here. All right. So, when you listen to the podcast and hear Beowulf in Old English, you will notice that the language is unrecognizable to modern English. And that is because of the mixing of languages. So this is one of those concepts that's really important to understand, is the blending of the languages and the cultures and the ideas. And that's really important to understanding Beowulf, and it's really important to understanding the history of the English language. Okay? The Old English is a mixture of 3 languages. It's the mixture of the Germanic languages, the Celtic languages, and Latin. And then after the Norman invasion, Old French. So it's actually 4. So when in its oldest form, it's just 3. It's Germanic, Celtic, and Latin. And then when it's newer Old English, that's not a real word, towards the end of the Old English period, they added in Norman French after the invasion of England by Normandy in 1066, but by William the Conqueror. So they add in Old French. So it's important to know that this is where the language emerged from. It emerged from these people. So that is how, if you're wondering about all these different groups of people, how did that affect the language? How did we get the language we have today? when you listen to the podcast, you'll notice it's completely unrecognizable because it's Latin and Celtic and German. It's not what we think of as modern language, and that's one of the things we'll talk about today. Is how talk about this semester is how language changed and how that affects how we perceive ourselves as speakers or readers or writers of English. Um, One of the things that I hear often said, and it always makes me chuckle, is when people say they have no understanding of the English language. They have terrible grammar and don't even understand the English language. That's really not true because the English language is actually unrecognizable to modern English if you think about it from its origins. They need to learn proper English. Well, what do they mean? Because if they're talking about Old English, it'd be unrecognizable. So before you get too snotty about that, think about what you're really saying. And that is that that person needs to understand who their audience is and what their purpose is, and they should apply the appropriate language, not talk about the properness of the grammar, because it really, to someone that's interested in linguistics, that sounds kind of silly. That's where our language, or the language that you're taking this course in English, um, comes from, is a mixture of all these languages, and over time people shorten things and change things for simplicity's sake, not unlike how we have changed and shortened things to send a text message. So it's really not that different. History always repeats itself, right? Okay, so just going back to Bede a bit, um, Bede wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people um, in Latin, and it was interspersed with patches of Anglo-Saxon. So he wrote in Latin because, as a member of the clergy, Latin would have been the language of Rome, and so that would have been the language that most people who were reading and writing at the time would have read and written in, either Latin or French, because that learned people would more than likely, people that were scholars would more than likely have a religious affiliation. So what's interesting about Bede is that he would also put in some Anglo-Saxon. And so what that did is that would show what the everyday language was kind of like. And also it narrates the successive waves of immigrations and invasions that made up medieval Britain in the 800s. Because his history is so extensive, you can see the way the language changes over the course of the history as he inserts it. We can kind of see a change of it. It's very interesting to people who are nerdy about that stuff like I am. Okay, so this brings us to Beowulf. Beowulf is the first English heroic epic. You know, you have your Greek epics, but Beowulf is what we call the English heroic epic. And the reason I'm doing air quotes and the reason I have quotations here is because if you think of it, it sounds kind of silly because we know that the people that wrote Beowulf, they wrote it in Old English. We know that they're I mean, I don't know, they're all from different places. They're not even thinking of themselves as English or British at this time, but we say it's the first English heroic epic because it's in that country. Okay, so they celebrate the exploits of a pagan hero, and it was originally oral, but later it was copied by scribes who were almost certainly clerics, who, if they were clerics, that means they would have been Christian. And so there is huge debate over how we date the text, the changes that are in the text, and the writing of the text, because there is an interesting intersection, you'll notice when you're reading, of Christianity and Christian ideals and pagan ritual. And so the reason that this is still a hotly contested debate is because the question is, when is Beowulf actually written down for the first time, and what changes were made by people that were writing who would have been members and workers for the church, and what would they have added in for their purposes in order to change the direction of how people felt about their epic. this is key to the debate that will make up your first major assignment. This is what we're going to be investigating. How do all of these things work together? What are the different themes that work together? And what do you think the date is? And where would you insert yourself into the conversation and the argument after you've reviewed all the evidence? Now, I'll be giving you the evidence in this case, and then you'll make your own argument. But this will be the key to the debate that will make up your first assignment. So be thinking about this as you're reading. What are the instances of pagan, and we'll talk about paganism and Christianity versus those ideals as we look at the Beowulf lecture. What are those similarities and differences you see? And, what would you add to that conversation? And there'll be more details on that later, but that's kind of just a preview ahead. So talking more about pagan and Christian tension and convergence. So medieval Britain, most work was in the vernacular. And what that means is everyday language used by the people, okay? So we would say, like, if I said y'all, that's the vernacular, okay? That's not actually, that's a vernacular common to Southern language, right? Southern English, Southern American English. So the vernacular is the everyday language that's used, and this vernacular was usually pagan in origin, and it tended to be orally composed and performed. Most works weren't written until later, and the ones that were written, they were mainly religious because it was the church who introduced writing in the Roman alphabet and trained clerics to write in the country as missionaries. So most of the poetry and the oral things that we have that are passed down from person to person to person, those were going to be in the everyday language, but the works that were written were going to be written by clerics who were involved in the church, but they would have tried to write in the everyday Old English instead of just strictly in Latin, because they would have wanted it to be for the people. Okay, so there's also some tension in this time. The pagan values, and I told you just a second ago we would talk about this. Bravery, loyalty, vengeance, and the desire for treasure. That's according to our text. And this often created violence in the culture. And it stood in contrast and tension with Christian values, which featured peace and forgiveness, contempt for worldly goods, and detachment from earthly forms of social, economic, and political power. That's according to Damarosh. I do want to mention, however, though, that doesn't mean that all Germanic pagans were violent or vengeful, and that doesn't mean that all Christian cultures were peaceful and forgiving. Okay, they're also people, so everyone has their own set of values. But even though there were these conflicts at the surface of things, they were alike in many respects, and they coexisted with many degrees of mutual influence for a very long time. And so that when we look, Beowulf is a perfect example of that, because we're able to see that. And this is the Ruthwell Cross. And so this is actually, if I can get it scrolled out, this is one of the carvings from this time period. And this shows the influence of Christianity in the time period. Let's go back over here. Okay. So at this time, there's two modes of literature. Now, these are some things that you would probably want to remember for, say, a quiz. There's two modes of literature, the heroic mode and the elegiac mode. So Beowulf is of the heroic variety. It celebrates the power and virtue of bravery, loyalty, and even some aspects of treasure. At the same time, in the end that the treasure is buried, the lords are dead, and bravery does not save the hero. However, these values themselves were not seen as worthless, but served as an example for the heroic past for later readers. And then there's the elegiac mode, and that is seen in like shorter poems like The Wanderer and The Wife's Lament, which we're not going to have time to read, but there are some shorter poems that are in the style of elegy, and that they're usually very based in heavily Christian virtue value things. Going back to the cross, here we go. So, oral poetry, written manuscripts. So, oral poets. The Celtic oral poets and the Anglo-Saxon poets, who were called scops, that's a good definition for you to remember. A scop was very important to the oral culture. They were the person that was the storyteller. They were the person that were the encyclopedias of the culture. They carried with them the history, the beliefs, the myths, the legends, and the values of systems in their pagan cultures. Scops would write the stories in their head, perform the stories, and they would learn the stories from other scops, and they would bring them into different communities and exchange stories and performances. Kind of like a really fancy, elaborate game of telephone. If you ever played that game when you were a kid, where you would go around the circle and whisper in each other's ear, and then at the end you would say what the original thing was and it would come out. Scops were like that, except with vast amounts of knowledge. And so you could see as cultures changed, the stories kind of started to change a little bit too. Word power was extremely important. Pagan poets and their works were seen as important and awe-inspiring. The power of the word and its makers was enhanced by the arrival of Christianity, a faith that attributes creation itself to an act of divine speech. And that's from Damaris on page 12. So their works were seen as important and awe-inspiring from the pagan point of view. They wanted the being able to record the history of their lives and tell these myths and tell these moral tales were extremely important. And Christianity didn't work against that. They actually worked great together. Manuscripts were seen as very powerful too. I mean, you would have to think how precious it would be to be able to have a piece of parchment and some sort of ink with which to draw or write a manuscript. And so a book was seen as something almost, mythical fairy tale like, and seemed to have great power and to have great reverence for it. That power of oral composition was transferred to the pages of manuscripts, and works began to be written and produced in beautiful, copied, and exquisitely decorated books of things like the Bible, the Book of Kells, the Gospels, and those pictures I showed you before, except the ones with the beasties, that's not from the Bible, but those are. It was also seen as being able to harness those magical powers of the oral tale, and so they were seen as very reverent. The manuscripts were. And you can tell that in the detail and the ornateness of them. Though I want to make it clear that not many people owned them. I mean, it would have been like a king would own a book. It's not going to be like, the guy that takes care of the horses. He's not going to have a book. They would have been considered treasures. So we get the Norman Conquest, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the Norman Conquest, because even though Beowulf is orally told before the Norman Conquest, it's when we look at the debate of when the manuscript was written, because we don't really know exactly when the manuscript was written. It's actually hotly debated in the medieval scholar realm, believe it or not. We talk about when it's written. It's important to understand about the Norman Conquest, because if you date the text before 1066 or date the text after 1066, then you don't really have to know as much about the Norman Conquest. But if you're going to make an informed opinion and you want to date the text after 1066, you need to know about the Norman Conquest. And here's the short and skinny of it. Basically, William of Normandy came over from Normandy, France, and he took over. I mean, he took over. And they moved from this confederation of just like diverse tribes and cultural groups, and he created a kingdom ruled by the Norman French. And so this is when you get the French influence on the language. And this is when it started to mix. And the people that were ruling and that had invaded and taken over and conquered, they would have spoken Norman French. And Anglo-Saxon would have been seen as a language that was, kind of of the people of the conquered. So it would have been seen as a little more unworthy or something like that. Sounds kind of ridiculous, but whatever. So here is a map of the Norman conquests. And so you can see this is what Normandy, the William the Conqueror comes and in 1066, and this is what he conquers, though it does take him time to take the whole thing, but you can trace the route. Here's France. He comes in and he's like, comes across the channel, starts conquering here, Battle of Hastings, and then he goes all the way through here, and eventually, you know, conquers that area. And so this is where the Norman French would be. Yes, thank you. I know you're in full screen. This is where the Norman French would have been. Okay. Another really important thing to understand is the social and religious order of people. And in order to understand Beowulf, you need to understand a little bit about feudalism. So feudalism is the dominant social system in medieval Europe, and it's where the nobles held lands from the crown in exchange for military service, and vassals were in turn tenants of the nobles, while the peasants were obliged to live on their lord's land and give him homage, labor, and share of the produce, notionally in exchange for military protection. Now, feudalism comes along after Beowulf, okay? Beowulf, there's still tribes, okay? But you can see in Beowulf some of the influences of the early beginnings of feudalism based upon the power that the king has, and the king's thanes are, which is the word they use in Beowulf for someone who is like the king's knight or vassal. You can see how the system is sort of similar, but it's not until later when the system becomes more fleshed out. And we'll talk more about the three estates and feudalism later, and I'll fill you in on this information. I'm speeding through it really fast later on, because that will be more important to the next section that we're reading. And I don't want you to get confused. I don't want you to think that in Beowulf's time they have the feudal system, because they don't. But it is kind of important to know that there is this class of kings, people that are related to the king, people that work in the king's service or related by marriage or whatever, and then the people that are being protected or taken care of. And that's an important part of understanding the tribe mentality. So that does it for this first part of the introduction to the Middle Ages, getting us ready for Beowulf. I hope this gave you some good information about the culture, and we'll be filling the rest of this in as we go along using this textbook. And I hope that if you have any questions, feel free to email me or ask them on the discussion board in week 2.